duties of American citizens, and they should be able to vote. And John Payton stood for that throughout his life. Thank you.
Thank you for adding that. And before I yield to the Congresswoman from the District of Columbia, I'd like to yield such time as she might consume to the gentlelady from Texas, also a very strong voice for justice and equality in this country, not just in her own district, but for Americans and for people across the world. The Congresswoman from Houston, Texas, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee.
Let me thank the gentlelady again for her leadership. I like to call her Dr. Christensen, and for, as my colleague from California indicated, for allowing us to have a voice on a regular basis on behalf of all of America, of our constituency, and certainly on behalf of the Congressional Black Caucus, of which I'll never step away from its definition as the conscience of this Congress, but the conscience of America. I want to thank my colleague, the Honorable Barbara Lee, who knows what justice and fighting for freedom is all about. I'm reminded of the very unique history of Oakland, California, and I think of the movement of justice through the Black Panthers of early years who did many things, but I remember them for their early breakfast and nutrition program, and I call that justice. And so let me just thank her for her leadership and leadership on many issues. To my colleague from the District of Columbia, the Honorable Eleanor Holmes Norton, let me thank her as well, and let me indicate that this is Emancipation Day. As I understand, there was a big parade, and that President Lincoln, just a few steps away from us, signed the freeing of the slaves in Washington, D.C., and you don't know the history of the District of Columbia until you hear it from Eleanor Holmes Norton, and I thank her very much, and I know of her friendship and closeness to John Payton. One of my dear friends and former federal judges that I know Eleanor Holmes Norton knows, Judge Gabriel McDonnell, likewise came through a similar history, and we have talked. I was an Earl Warren legal scholar, and so I know the journey that so many have traveled. And so this is a personal statement as I rise to salute John Payton and also acknowledge his wife, Gay McDougall. And I want to say this on behalf of my husband, Elwin C. Lee, Dr. Elwin C. Lee, graduate of Yale Law School, and who knew Gay very well, and I knew her. And what a perfect match and family of justice fighters, of human rights fighters, individuals who could be as eloquent on the question of HIV/AIDS, international plague and devastation that it impacts so many vulnerable communities. Here they are discussing the worldwide siege of AIDS upon individuals, but likewise can come home and march along the roads of justice here in the United States of America. I learned in law school that the law, and I know that Congresswoman Holmes Norton still teaches, and I know that the law is a jealous mistress. And I would say to you that I found that out. Obviously, I'm now in the United States Congress, but I love the law. And I love the purpose and values of lawyers. And I encourage young lawyers, if they want to read a story of sacrifice and someone who epitomizes that it's a jealous mistress, read the history of John Adolphus Payton, born in 1946 and passed this past March 22nd in Baltimore, Maryland. He obviously from California, but with a law degree from Harvard Law School, and that means that the door was open the world was his oyster, and it was open to any manner of choice that he could have made in his lifetime. He was a federal clerk, but he managed to start his life at Wilma Hale, which used to be, I believe, Wilma Cutler and Pickering, which is where my husband practiced law here in Washington, D.C. For a number of years. What I like most of all is that his reach was so far on the Independent Electoral Commission in South Africa, again, looking for justice, president of the District of Columbia Bar. But he found his way to his calling. He found his way to answer the opportunities that he was given. Being a 1977 graduate of Harvard Law School, he stood on the shoulders of Thurgood Marshall, graduate of Howard Law School. He stood on the shoulders of the giants that graduated from law school in Arkansas and the other giants that graduated from Howard. And I think he found his comfort level at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, becoming the 6th president. And my classmate, Elaine Jones, served in that capacity for a very long time, graduating from the University of Virginia Law School. And today, in the wonderful tributes, she was part of that wonderful memorial service that was held here in Washington, D.C., along with a number of other giants. But let me just say to you that when we think of justice, we have a combination from the civil rights leaders to the fallen Dr. King on the balcony in Memphis, Tennessee. But do we know all the lawyers that were part of the matrix of justice? From Thurgood, who held the hand of Dr. King and the number of civil rights leaders, one after another, some of our giant lawyers down in Alabama and Mississippi who were there to bond them out, to petition their case. Well, in the likes of those, John Payton became an unselfish fighter for justice. From his, what I call, victory of Richmond Croson in a 5-4 decision, it was a victory, where he attempted to maintain the affirmative action plan that established just a simple process of assisting businesses to receive opportunities. I want you to know today that because of lawsuits like that, we are suffering in cities all around America, because there were those who believed that just a smidgen of opportunity was too much. Right in my own city of Houston, under the General Services Administration, that I hope will be cleaned up, and I know there are good people there, we have Gilbane, a major company, using stimulus dollars and having no concern about the in-depth minority participation of small businesses, the GSA hopeless and helpless in being able to do anything, and having a non-diverse workforce. Gilbane, let the number go out as an example of what John Payton was fighting against. And then, of course, his valiant fight in 2003, the University of Michigan affirmative action cases, that is maintained today as he defended the school's use of race at their admissions processes, again, not using it destructively. That is, I think, one of the argument that is not a legal argument, but he found a way to justify the Trial Court of Appeals and U.S. Supreme Court defending undergraduate schools' use of race in their admissions processes, and the loss in the United States Supreme Court 6-3, but in any event, maintaining the fight and taking cases that were not popular. John, thank you. Thank you, Gay, for sharing him. And then a 2009 case, Northwest Austin Municipal Utility District No. 1 versus Holder, a municipal district in Austin, Texas, my state, challenged the validity of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Payton assisted in the arguments leading to the Supreme Court's 8-1 decision upholding Section 5. He was our firewall on the question of Section 2 and Section 5. He was the holder of the truth, the arbiter, the outside partner to the Department of Justice that wanted and needed to do right. And finally, the local attorney for the plaintiffs in 2010, Lewis v. City of Chicago, in which a group of African Americans seeking to be firefighters contended that they had properly filed a charge of discrimination. In my understanding, that case has moved along and that John prevailed, so that truth would be the call of the day. It is important to hold him up as the man of armor who was nonviolent, and he held as his victory call the Constitution and the laws that were passed to help the unempowered. I've always said that the Voting Rights Act is not the Black Voting Rights Act or the Hispanic Voting Rights Act. It is the Voting Rights Act to have one vote, one person for every single American. My hat goes off to John Payton, and I salute him as a soldier on the battlefield for justice, for what is right, never wavering, with his quiet demeanor but strength in the courthouse. I ask the NAACP Legal Defense Fund to stay the course. I ask you to never whimper and never weaken. And I say to you that your soldier is going on to be a general in the justice cause in a place beyond. I beg of you to carry forward. Let me just read these citations that I thought that I had that were in honor of him, just very briefly, from a statement from the LDF, where they spoke about the city of Chicago, the Lewis case, which indicated the rights, or vindicated, I'm sorry, the rights of over 6,000 applicants. As I indicated, that case prevailed. They called him fearless, a guiding light, a brilliant advocate, a mentor, a teacher who believed that American democracy thrives when it embraces all of our voices. Thank you to the Legal Defense Fund. And then from one of the major law firms, partner Walter Dellinger, had this to say: John Payton was a towering figure. He was just flat out brilliant and combined the intellectual power with a deep and empathetic commitment to justice. Everyone who knew John will remember forever his infectious good spirit and uninhibited laugh. Every encounter with John was a learning experience. Let me close on this note, because I know that John would have been in the midst of discussing this travesty of justice as relates to Trayvon Martin. Trayvon obviously was a symbol of the injustice of this nation when a police and state prosecutor became judge and jury. I don't want to interfere with the process of justice. Mr. Zimmerman is arrested. But let us not rest on our laurels, because we pushed for the arrest that should have been. We know that there will be a rocky road proceeding toward holding Mr. Zimmerman accountable. More importantly, let me make it very clear on the floor of the House that every mode of justice that is needed for a fair trial, I support. If it is to remove the judge, as the defense has asked for, let that be considered in an unbiased manner. If by chance the prosecution asks for a change of venue because this jury pool in this region will be tainted, then so be it. But what we must also say, and let me be very clear, I, as a Democrat, and I hope my friends on the other side, are not afraid of dealing with gun violence and the overuse of guns in America as responsible legislators should. And so, to my good friend Bill Cosby, let me say to you, let me say to you that the call has been answered many times. There are many bills dealing with gun violence. There are many bills to rail in the reckless use of guns, the use of the assault weapons, the issue of individuals not being checked at gun shows and the gun show loophole. It only takes responsible leadership to move it forward. And I salute the Brady Society and Association that will be with us on the floor, not on the floor, but in Washington tomorrow, for recognizing that there are people who are willing to take a stand, not against your Second Amendment rights. God bless you for those rights. You have those rights. I celebrate those rights. But I cannot celebrate the fact that a man that was in the neighborhood watch, that is the eyes and ears, was walking around with a 9mm that shot dead an unarmed, helpless 17-year-old boy and snuffed his life out because we refuse to address the question of everyone being able to carry a gun, whether trained or not. Mr. Zimmerman was not a police officer and should not have acted as if he was the law, the judge, and the jury. And so, to my good friends on the floor who will come up after me, let me just end my note by paying and saying to John Payton, in instances like Trayvon, I know that your voice would have been heard on the civil rights of the question, but your voice had been heard through places where many of us were not there and did not know. And so I agree and salute the words that were offered in tribute to you by so many of your colleagues, but certainly these last words that indicate that you were in fact fearless, you were in fact a guiding light, you were in fact a brilliant advocate, mentor and teacher, you are in fact an eagle with wings who stood widespread over America. And when there was a doubt about justice, you led the troops of the NAACP in a nonviolent, constitutional, law-saturated effort to ensure that justice be done. May God rest your soul for a job well done, good and faithful servant, and may your family and Gay know how much we loved you and appreciated the war that you waged for justice. I yield back.
Thank you, Congresswoman Lee, for that very strong and impassioned and very well-deserved tribute to John Payton this evening. And as I yield to the gentlelady from the District of Columbia, let me, on behalf of the people of the Virgin Islands who celebrate emancipation on July 3rd, wish the residents of the District of Columbia happy Emancipation Day.
Well, I thank the gentlelady for yielding. I did not know of the Emancipation Day of the Virgin Islands. Please, I reciprocate and want to know more about the Virgin Islands Emancipation Day. I want to thank the gentlelady from the Virgin Islands, especially who handles these special orders for the Congressional Black Caucus on the floor, for the time and effort she's given this evening. I want to thank my colleagues who have come down so far for this hour. You've just heard from my good friend, the Congresswoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee. I thank her for her remarks, and I thank her as well for mentioning Emancipation Day here in the District of Columbia, where thousands of residents marched down Pennsylvania Avenue to claim the rights that every constituent of every member who pays taxes in the United States already has. So I know that I speak for the district when I thank you for that. And when I say that John Payton was a very, very devoted Washingtonian who would have particularly appreciated Emancipation Day today, I thank Congresswoman Barbara Lee, whose words always are important to hear as she probes the issues of the hour, and especially what she had to say tonight about John Payton. My condolences first to my good friend Gay McDougall, John's wife, and to his siblings and his family. Memorial service was held today, so it's fitting that we should be able to get this hour to say a few words in tribute. I'd like to say, devote my words to both the man and the lawyer. John was my constituent and my friend. It's important to get a feel for the man. If I may inquire how much time we have remaining in this hour.
I'm going to take about 5.
The gentlelady from the Virgin Islands has 32 minutes remaining.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. There have been only 6 leaders of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund since Thurgood Marshall first went on the bench. You can imagine what quality of lawyer it takes to fill the role that Thurgood Marshall had at the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. John Payton was worthy of the role, worthy to become the 6th leader of the fund. If you looked at John's professional credentials, you would have thought that's enough of a life for a man to have lived for, considering particularly that he is an African American who went to college and law school when blacks were only beginning to be admitted to the best colleges and law schools in the country. But before his life was over, much too early, John had been listed on this decade's list of most distinguished lawyers in our country. He had been president of the District of Columbia Bar. John's life and work, of course, is etched in important Supreme Court cases. We in the District of Columbia feel especially the loss of John Payton, because John Payton was what was called Corporation Counsel, is now called Attorney General of the District of Columbia. And he left that, he took that post when he was asked by the mayor to leave private practice in order to become the lead lawyer in the District of Columbia. To understand John, though, one has to see how this extraordinary man melded his love of the law, including private practice, with the love of his life, civil rights. It's clear that John laid down an early marker for what his life would become, that it would be a life dedicated to eliminating racial discrimination. John went to Pomona College in 1965 when these colleges were just admitting talented African Americans, and he found himself in an elite private college surrounded only by people who were not at all from like him. They were like him in many ways, but they certainly didn't come from his background. There were very few African Americans in his college and in the 5 colleges in Claremont, California, that group of very fine private colleges. So John began early, right in college, to recruit or to lobby the administration to recruit more African American students. And of course he wanted a Black Studies program because he saw that perhaps one of the reasons that there was so little interest in Black students is there was too little appreciation for the role of African Americans in our history. So he lobbied for that. And then he lobbied for the admissions people to in fact recruit more African Americans. And when he lobbied so hard, the college asked him to take the job. So John, having insisted that more African Americans be recruited when he graduated, took the job himself and delayed going to law school. That was John Payton. Well, he went on to Harvard Law School, but he couldn't leave behind his dedication to human rights. He got involved in the very famous, infamous, one might say, school busing controversy in Boston. While he was a law student, he found himself taking affidavits from Black students who were injured because of racial violence in Boston. In law school, he decided to join the editorial board of the Harvard Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Law Review. You see the theme developing in John's life. Of course, many students have these themes, and we're pleased that they have them when they do, but there's nothing that says you've got to devote your life to any particular cause, and particularly if you're an African American and experiencing the first opportunities to, for example, join private law firms. Well, John did just that. He went on to practice corporation law and here in Washington, D.C. at a prestigious law firm when it was rare for blacks to practice privately in elite law firms. He went on to head litigation in his law firm. And then he did something that describes how John Payton put together all of the ingredients of a man of the law. He took leave from the law firm to become corporation counsel for the District of Columbia. He recognized that while he had been taking civil rights cases as a private lawyer pro bono, and yes, he could come and serve his city as the lead counsel. He met his wife, interestingly enough, when he was working on monitoring the elections in South Africa, and that was, as my good friend from Texas has said, a meeting that was made in heaven, perhaps. Well, she did not say it that way. I say it that way, because it's one of those wonderful marriages which bring together people of like heart and like mind. John, of course, will be remembered for his work in many ways at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, though he did not get to do all that he set out to do. For example, John continued to take the Legal Defense Fund along the road it had traveled so well as lead law firm or lead litigator for civil rights in our country. But he recognized that the Legal Defense Fund had already won many of the most important cases, and that therefore the fund had to stay relevant, stay current. To quote him, when asked about whether he thought the problems of African Americans could be solved through litigation, and he said, I'd say we have a litigation focus, and some of our focus is not litigation. With some things, you want to achieve a solution without filing a lawsuit. You can go to the relevant entities, a school board or mayor, and suggest a solution without having to file a lawsuit. Here is a man who brought from private practice problem solving of many varieties, just the man for the Legal Defense Fund in this era. Of course, he will be remembered for cases of great importance. Sometimes the case needed a lawyer with such a fine technical sense of the law that all of the civil rights, human rights issues revolved around whether you had found a law whose mind was fine enough to tackle such an issue. Lewis versus City of Chicago was such a case where African American firefighters filed a lawsuit charging discrimination by the city against African American firefighters. The city conceded that it had given an examination which had a disparate effect on minorities in violation of Supreme Court cases. But they argued that there was a statute of limitations issue, and that therefore John Payton and his African American plaintiffs could not continue. It took a lawyer's lawyer, to take that case, argue that statute of limitations issue, and go before the Supreme Court and get this Supreme Court to unanimously reverse the lower court, which had found the statute of limitations voided the case. Today, one of the core sections of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is under attack. If that law goes down, we will be set back 50 years. That section goes down. It's the core provision of the Voting Rights Act that requires states which have engaged in intentional voting discrimination in the past to bring all of its voting laws, laws that impact voting rights, so that they can be pre-cleared by the Justice Department before they go into effect. Every time that there is particularly a case that may seem for some of the opponents of Section 5, and there are many, to be ripe, such a case will come before the Supreme Court. Northwest Austin Municipal Utility versus Holder was such a case, 8-1 decision upholding Section 5. It is impossible to overemphasize how important John Payton's victory was in sustaining this core provision of the Voting Rights Act. He did so and won a great victory for civil rights. He was lead counsel in a case that is still very much discussed, a case which has a new case, a case based on it, going before the Supreme Court this very year. I'm speaking of the University of Michigan case, where the plaintiffs sought to eliminate affirmative action in higher education in both law and undergraduate schools, and there was great trepidation that much of the progress that had been made over 25 years would go prematurely. John handled these cases in the lower courts and argued the case at the Supreme Court as well, and as we know, the court found that the law school that upheld the use of race as a factor, one factor, not the factor, and affirmative action in higher education was saved. I would like to submit for the record a piece written by a colleague and friend of John Payton, Joshua Weiner, W-I-N-E-R. Joshua Weiner wrote a short piece after John Payton died, which in a real sense details one occasion that summarizes the principled nature of John's life. He was on the board of an organization called Appleseed, which does good works for the District of Columbia. The District of Columbia had a financial control board during a period when the city was going through a financial crisis. The control board took control of the D.C. Board of Education. The D.C. Board of Education had a terrible reputation. They engaged in a lot of infighting in order to keep half-empty schools open, for example, and all agreed they'd done nothing for higher education, for education rather, in the District of Columbia.
To have documents submitted to the record is granted.
He agreed to just take it for the record.
I thank the Speaker. How much time do I have left? I want to leave some time for my colleague.
5 minutes. 5 minutes.
The gentlelady from the Virgin Islands has 16 minutes remaining.
So think about another 5.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The control board reached out to take control of the Board of Education. It had control of virtually every other arm of the D.C. government. But John Payton and the Board of Appleseed knew that the law which set up the control board gave it no authority to, in fact, take over the Board of Education. It was an elected body. What to do? Appleseed very much opposed the Board of Education. Yet, the Board of Education had done an illegal act, except nobody knew it but technical lawyers or people who paid attention to the fine letter of the law. The Appleseed board engaged in the appropriate debate as to whether they should sue the control board for illegal action in taking over a decrepit, terrible Board of Education. John Payton cast the deciding vote against. John cast the deciding vote for the lawsuit. And he did so because he said he did not want to be part of an organization that failed to stand for the rule of law. How did John Payton handle this? He knew that the board didn't stand for the children. What he did, as a part of the Appleseed Board was to settle the case ultimately, that returned the power to the school board, and then to work through the enactment of a law which then passed the District of Columbia, approving that approved the restructuring of school governance, giving governance to the mayor and eliminating the Board of Education. So you see what John did. He stood for principle on both occasions. He found a principled way to keep the control board from exceeding its authority illegally, and he found a principled way to eliminate the D.C. school board without using illegal means. That is the kind of principled life that John Payton lived. That is why he has left a gaping, terrible vacuum in this city where he lived and in the law which he loved. He said he never regretted leaving corporate law. Remember, while he practiced it, he was also doing pro bono cases for civil rights. But he never regretted leaving it, he said, because the best possible job for a man like John Payton was the job he had when he died. John Payton said, as on the 70th anniversary of the NAACP Legal Defense and Education, when everybody was joyful as well they might have been. There's no organization which has done more for human rights in our country than the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. While celebrating, John, its president, its director counsel, said, "It's a mistake to celebrate too much about things accomplished when we see that some of the progress has been very uneven." Somehow, John was a man of great balance. He understood that, as he said, African Americans had made extraordinary progress in the 70 years since the NAACP Legal Defense Fund was established. And the other part of him said that what had driven him into civil rights in the first place continued to drive him and must continue to drive us. The best way that we can today remember our friend, his work, the man, is to understand that what he would want us to do is to find a way to help complete the work he was about at the end of his life. His inspiration to young lawyers, his inspiration well beyond the law was so great that I say to my good friend from the Virgin Islands that I believe that we will have no hesitation. We will find no hesitation in the greater community in seeking to do all we can to continue the work that was the center of the life of John Payton. We celebrate his life today. We celebrate a great life in the American law. We celebrate a great Washingtonian. We celebrate all that John did. We mourn his early passing. We celebrate and are grateful that in the time given to him, he accomplished so very, very much. I thank my good friend from the Virgin Islands and yield her the balance of my time.
Thank you, Congresswoman Holmes Norton. It was wonderful to have you here, a close friend, close colleague of John Payton's, to give us a more in-depth history, not only of his accomplishments, but of the man himself. And we thank you for joining us. Herself, a very strong fighter for justice and equality, a legal scholar like John Payton, who has also devoted her life, like he did, to justice and equality. I want to just close by saying a few words myself about John Payton and the work that we still have yet to do. It was at the retreat of the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, even as we were remembering, eulogizing, and coming to terms with the loss of our chairman and colleague and friend Don Payne, that we learned of John's passing. It was distressing and disconcerting to think that at this time when we need strong fighters for equality and justice more than ever, that not only Donald Payne, but now John Payton would also be taken away from us. But we are blessed that we have their legacies, the body of their work and contributions, and that standing on them and their inspiration, we can be strengthened to continue the fight that they led so well. Later than many of my colleagues, I first came to know John Payton personally in 2003 when he was at the firm at what was then Wilmer, Cutler and Pickering, now Wilmer Hale. At that time, as you heard, he was the lead counsel for the 2003 University of Michigan affirmative action cases. In the end, the Supreme Court upheld the law school's affirmative action policy in a related case. But I also came to know John Payton and his wife, Gay McDougall, as you heard at the conference that I attended with Congresswoman Barbara Lee, a UN conference in Geneva on voter participation, which Barbara was the lead, the director of that conference. But John's work in civil rights, as you heard, began from his undergraduate time at Pomona College and continued when at Harvard Law School he worked with students injured in the race riot-related violence during the Boston's school busing controversy. Many students at the law schools at Harvard, Howard, and Georgetown, where he was a visiting professor at varying times, were fortunate to have the benefit of his experience and his expertise. He was active in many domestic and international causes. Along with his wife, an international human rights lawyer, Gay McDougall, he was one of the international monitors in South Africa in the very first election in which South African blacks could vote at the time that Nelson Mandela was elected president. The Legal Defense Fund said of him that he was, quote, a guiding light, a brilliant advocate, a mentor and a teacher who believed that American democracy thrives when it embraces all of our voices, end of quote. President Barack Obama called him a true champion of equality and said that he helped to protect civil rights in the classroom and at the ballot box. And so as we honor John Payton and his legacy, we recommit ourselves to continue his and our fight for justice. Last week, I participated in the 2012 National Environmental Justice Conference and Training Program, where administration officials, researchers, and advocates from all over the country convened here in Washington, D.C. It was distressing to hear of the communities in this country which today are suffering health impacts and still, in 2012, have to fight to be free of polluting industries and for clean air and water. These persistent environmental justices cry out for justice. The case of 17-year-old TRAYVON Martin, who was killed by a neighborhood watch volunteer as he, TRAYVON, walked home, has not only aroused sympathy for the family, but justified anger over his senseless killing. But it has also revived the long and shameful history of racial profiling in this country and our flagrant and reckless use of guns and the gun culture that so many people promote here. TRAYVON's death is tragic in and of itself, but sadly, that story has been and continues to be told in countless communities across our nation. Our children and our families cry out for justice. The wealth gap continues to widen dangerously in this country. According to the Pew Foundation, the wealth of white families here is 20 times that of African Americans and 18 times that of Latinos. The Health Policy Institute of the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies has issued several recent reports that showed how poverty, including extreme poverty, and persistent segregation create health, education, economic, and other disparities. To quote Angus Deaton of Princeton University in a recent paper, this is a quote, "There are grounds to be concerned about the rapid expansion and inequality at the very top of the income distribution in the United States. This is not only an injustice in itself, but it poses a risk of spawning injustices in education, in health, and in governance," end of quote. The increasing income inequality in this country also cries out for justice. And I could go on, but let me just end with health. Every year there are over 80,000 excess deaths in people of color, deaths that could and should and must be prevented. Every minority group suffers some health disparity, African Americans and American Indians and Alaskan Natives more than most. Many of these deaths and the countless disproportionate disabilities could be prevented with the continued implementation of the Affordable Care Act. It is health injustice that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. called the most shocking and inhumane. The countless and seemingly endless years of these tragic health inequities and the millions of people who have suffered because of them also cry out for justice. It is to ending these and other injustices that John Payton dedicated his life. In an article in the Civil Rights Monitor, he said, "The problems of race and inequality in our country have proven to be enduring and deep-seated in nature, but we must recognize that this is a marathon and not just a race if we are to find solutions that work." We are grateful for the leg of the marathon that he ran and the progress that he made in this race while he was with us. To his wife Gay, his sisters Jeanette Oliver and Susan Grissom, his brother Glenn Spears, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and his many colleagues and friends, I join my CBC colleagues in offering our sincere condolences and those on behalf of the people of the U.S. Virgin Islands. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of our time.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio rise?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House do now adjourn.
The question is on the motion to adjourn. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the House stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow for morning hour debate.
So the House has wrapped up legislative work for the day, passing bills awarding congressional gold